want to be in later, where it's more about efficiency and effectiveness, you should pick a particular stage. And then the final piece of advice I give is to pick a winner. Now, in my experience as a venture capitalist, one of the most important things when you jump into startup land is to try to be in a winner, a growing company that you think has a very good chance of success. It's difficult to do. In fact, I fail more than I succeed, as do all of the venture capitalist colleagues in my business, because we are all taking risks in these companies very early on. And I'll come back to the risk for you. But picking a winner is an incredibly important part of the process, and I'll give you a couple things how to think about that, similar to how a venture capitalist would think about that. And there are three simple pieces of picking a winner. First is evaluate the opportunity as we do. As an investor, you think about the team and its quality, the market and its size, and finally, the business model. These are the typical criteria, these three elements, that venture capitalists apply when they evaluate whether they want to invest in a startup. When we invest in a portfolio of companies. You're investing in your career, so the stakes are even higher. You want to be really careful about picking the right startup to join. So try to find a team that inspires you, that you think is an outstanding team with exceptional ability, a team that you would want to work with in the next company, a market that's massive in size, many billions of dollars, facing tremendous disruption, and finally a business model that's attractive, has network effects, recurring revenue, and high gross margins. If you apply those criteria, you have a good chance of picking a winner. You should also network your way around the ecosystem. Once you pick a city, a domain, and a stage, you've narrowed your set of criteria, and then you can begin to talk to venture capitalists, lawyers, other entrepreneurs and CEOs and founders, recruiters, and so on and so forth. People in the ecosystem whose concept of and judgment of who is a winner you respect. And then you can begin to develop a nice short list of the relevant companies that are winners in the stage you're most interested in the domain you're most interested in the city that's of most interest to you. And I think we have a viewer question.
Yes, we do. Thank you, Jeff. We're getting a few questions in now, but first we'd like to thank our sponsor, LogMeIn Rescue. Now let's take the first question. Is it good to start your career in a startup, or should you start at a big company first before moving over?
It's a great question, and it's one I get a lot. I have a bias in this area, which is that if you want to be in startup land and build your career there, you should jump in. Being in a big company doesn't necessarily allow you to develop the skills necessary to be effective and successful in startup land. It's much better to be a part of a winner, maybe a later stage winner, a growth stage company that's larger, and be able to ride that out and learn from the best practices of startups than being at a big company and learn the best practices of a large company bureaucracy. Great. So once you've done those things, you now have a short list of companies that are of interest to you. You've picked a city, a domain, a stage, and you've picked a winner. So now, how do you position yourself well? If you've picked a winner, it's probably growing fast and is hiring a lot of people. And so there's most likely going to be a match if you come with the right positioning. And there are two things that I recommend here that are very important on how to position yourself well. I'll go in this direction. The first is arrange for a warm introduction. Startup land is a very tightly networked ecosystem, and people in that ecosystem pride themselves on having many connections and many relationships. If you can't find a warm way in, it's very easy for them to dismiss you. And I'll give you one example. Last week I was talking to a student at Brown University who's a computer science undergrad, and he told me he had submitted his resume to a company off the website that he had chosen in a city, in a domain, and at a stage that he was most excited about. And he picked a great company. That company had not responded to him. His resume went into the great mass of unwashed resumes. But he asked a friend who had a connection to that company about the company, and could you provide me with a warm introduction? As soon as that email chain was triggered, he immediately got a call back or an email back from HR saying, "Would love to talk to you. You look like a great fit for what we're looking for." So a warm introduction is incredibly important. You don't have to do anything differently. You just have to navigate your way in using LinkedIn, using Facebook, whatever the mechanism is, find a way to a warm introduction. The second thing that I recommend to positioning yourself well with startups is come bearing gifts. And what I mean by that is, to coin a little bit of JFK, ask not what the startup can do for you, but ask what you can do for the startup. When you meet with a startup, don't have that lean back orientation. You want to lean in and show them that you really care about what they're doing and that you've given it some thought, their business, their market position, and that you have something to add, that you have some gifts to contribute. One amazing example of this is a former student of mine who was trying to transition from investment banking into startup land, decided on a particular set of companies, one company in particular, that matched her criteria using this rubric. And so before she went to contact that company was a point-of-sale software provider for restaurants. She walked up and down the street and visited 50 restaurants and interviewed them on what they use for their point-of-sale system. She then developed that information, developed insights that came out of those interviews, put it together into a presentation, and then approached the company through a warm introduction. She sat down with one of the company executives, and immediately before he could say, "You don't have a startup background, I'm not sure you would be a fit here," she immediately launched into her analysis. He thought it was so compelling, he didn't even want to hear more about her background. He wanted her to come in and present to the rest of his co-founders what she had learned and her insights. And she was hired a few weeks later. So if you come with a point of view, if you come having done your homework and have a point of view that you can share with the startup, it's incredibly powerful. So that's the simple rubric that I encourage the folks who are interested in joining startups to pursue. Figure out if you're a fit, pick the right company for you, really thinking through city, domain, stage, and winner, and then positioning yourself well. Really find a way to navigate. And so I would love audience questions. So fire away. What do people want to hear about in the context of entering startup land and thinking about managing their startup careers?
Yes, we're getting a lot of questions, so thank you, everybody. Please do keep them coming. So this one is in from Richard, and he's asking, do you think it's better to earn a salary in a startup or to invest the salary for the growth of the startup?
That's a great question, Richard. I get a lot of questions about trade-offs between cash and equity. And here are a couple ways that you might want to think about this. First of all, when you think about the hierarchy of a startup and the different levels that startup executives represent, with the founder at the top, the VPs, the directors, and the managers, you have to think about, if you were a founder and you have a finite amount of equity that you want to distribute, how much of that equity do you give to each of the various folks? So many founders, let's say, will have 25% of their equity be for the management team, and 75% is what's required from investors in order to raise money to build the business. And then that money is then distributed, or that equity, I should say, is distributed amongst the various levels and the various individuals. You have to make an assessment based on the amount of equity that you're given or that you're able to negotiate and how it compares to cash. And you have to think about whether you value the company in a similar way versus cash. And here's how I would think about it. I like to run scenarios under certain assumptions, what percent of the company that you have, and what could be the outcomes. So let's say a $10 million outcome, a $100 million outcome, and a $1 billion outcome as the total enterprise value for the company. And then you run your percentage against that. If you were able to get 1% of the company, 0.1% of the company, 0.2% of the company, 0.3% of the company, and calculate the numbers, and then think about where you think the probability